afternoon, all. So today we have the final talk of the theme, namely vistas in spatio-temporal modeling. And today's speaker is Professor Jaya Sreevalsan Nair, who is from IIIT-B. And she'll be speaking about multi-scale computation thinking in data science. Professor Ashok is the session chair for today's talk. And Professor Ashok is currently an associate professor here at IIIT-Bangalore. And his research falls in the areas of complex systems, nonlinear dynamics, biomechanics, and biology motivated problems, theoreticals of condensed matter, and polymer physics. So I'll hand over the stage to Professor Ashok now.
Yes, thank you, Professor Nikhil. Good afternoon, everyone. Today's talk, which is the last talk in the Samvaad theme based on vistas and spatio-temporal modeling, is going to be given by Professor Jaya Sreevalsan Nair, who is a faculty member here at IIIT-B. She leads the graphics visualization computing lab and is one of the core team members of the eHealth Research Center at IIIT-B. Professor Jaya obtained her PhD in computer science from the University of California, Davis, and subsequently was a scientific programmer at Nthought Incorporated, Austin, and was a research associate at the Texas Advanced Computing Center at the University of Texas at Austin prior to joining IIIT-B. Her research interests include data visualization, scientific computing, computer graphics, and computational geometry. She works on modeling data for effective visualizations and identifying appropriate visualizations for complex data sets in data science workflows. Her focus on data modeling is also using second-order tensors, matrices, and networks for varied applications. And some of her recent work includes uncertainty analysis of the semantic classification of LiDAR point clouds, spatial and statistical analysis of population surveys, automated data extraction from chart images, and community detection in biological and brain networks. Professor Jaya's work has been supported by grants from various agencies, including SERB, DST, the government of Karnataka, Intel, IBM, to name just a few. She is also an ACM member and an IEEE senior member. She is currently serving as an associate editor of IEEE Transactions on Circuits and Systems for Video Technology, and is the chair of the IEEE Geoscience and Remote Sensing Society, Bangalore section state. So without further ado, I'll hand over the mic to Professor Jaya for a talk on multi-scale computational thinking in data science. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Ashok. Thank you for the nice introduction. So today I'll be talking about multi-scale computational thinking in data science. Since this is a talk in the theme of spatio-temporal modeling, a lot of the examples I would be using would be in the area of in applications pertaining to spatio-temporal data. So with that, I'll just begin. So today, the agenda of today's talk would be, I would introduce very lightly what computational thinking is and how multi-scale methods can be sort of incorporated in them, and what is the uncertainty in data that we're looking at. And I'll show a few examples where we have used multi-scale methods, and I'll conclude the talk. So with that, I'll just get started. So what is computational thinking? So computational thinking in itself is a pedagogical term, which is largely used to improve the computer science education as prescribed by the ACM and sort of practiced everywhere. So computational thinking comes in the set of terminologies we use, just like algorithmic thinking or mathematical thinking, etc. Right? So computational thinking itself was popularized by Professor Jeanette Wing in her eponymous communications to ACM article in 2006, even though it was originated earlier by Seymour Papert in 1980, and it was practiced well before that. Okay? To sort of close a loop, this is a very contentious term in terms of the pedagogy that has to be practiced for it. but in itself, the practice of computational thinking is something that is prescribed for understanding data in itself. Right. So from all the different versions of computational thinking, its definition, etc., what we see is that it is a way of thinking in the context of computer science largely, and it consists of the following classes of elements. This has been put together in 2020 because of the problem with uh, no consensus in what computational thinking itself is. Right. So the elements include mental or thought process. So that would include algorithmic thinking, logical thinking, abstraction, etc. And it includes methods, that's automation, parallelization, modeling, simulation, etc. Um, Practices would be the third one, that's experimenting, iterating, tinkering, test and debug, reuse and remix. And transversal skills is the last one, which is like design and recreate, create, communicate and collaborate, etc. So when we talk of multi-scale methods, it broadly comes under the second category, that is the methodology. Okay, so before I get into why I call it multi-scale computational thinking, let's first understand what multi-scale methods themselves are. So broadly, multiscaling is a computational method. It's a model which represents also and is also used for processing or analyzing data at different scales. Now, in the context of data science, we can see that coming up in image processing and computer vision as an example. So in this particular domain, this is when we talk of multi-scale methods, it originates from the scale space theory that several scientists came up with, and of which Tony Lindeberg's papers talk a lot about scale space theory. And what scale space theory says is that an image can have multi-scale representation, which is motivated from physics and biology vision. And what it implies is we get different views of the same image, and it can be categorized as coarse to fine levels, and which can be put together, which can be modeled together in the form of a pyramid. Thus, we get a hierarchical model. So just like we can talk about the coarsest level is contained in the next finest level, and so on and so forth until we reach the finest level, which is the original image. So if we look at the images here, we can see that this is the original image. And as we apply a Gaussian filter, where a scale is defined as a parameter of the Gaussian filter itself, we can see it gets blurred. This is what is referred to as going from the finest to the coarsest level. Now, so that was with respect to image processing and computer vision. So let's just look at scales broadly, right, before I get into science and engineering data set. So we have this notion of self and a local neighborhood when we talk about scales. So what we're saying here is we are going to analyze a particular data item by itself and the neighborhoods that it assumes. So with this, we can say that there is a particular set of influences that come from not just the specific data item, but also its neighborhood. So these influences can be the influences from external sources to self, or it can be from one to the neighbors. So whichever way we look at it, right? So as an example, if we look at in the form of images, we see that a pixel is also influenced by its neighborhood. So the neighboring pixels also have very similar information that we have at a particular pixel. So that's essentially what we mean by the local neighborhood. Now, why is it important? It is important because local neighborhood itself embodies locality types. So we are talking about spatial locality or temporal locality if we look at it from the point of view of physics. But we can also look at it in abstract spaces Like for example, we look at in the image space, we are looking at the continuity in say the Gaussian filters, because the parameters that govern the scales are in that space, right? So we can take it in some other space as well. Now, going back to the computational methods. So we talked about what scales are. Now going back to what computational methods are, we look at how we can use these scales to analyze data. Most times when we say analysis of data, it's a very broad term and quite vague at its best. But what we are talking about here is mainly how can we extract salient information from a particular data item based on its neighborhood, which is governed by these scales. Now, so because of the way in which we define scales and we use them, there are several computational variations that can happen. So some of it comes from the different definitions we have for local neighborhood itself. So I will show you in one of the examples later on what we mean by that. But as a sneak peek, I can say that a local neighborhood can be I count the k nearest neighbor from me, or I can say that in the radius of 1 kilometer, whoever is my neighbor can be defined as a local neighbor. Now, there can be also variations where I compute features for myself with respect to, say, my distance from my neighbors. Or I can also say that, okay, I take a collective feature by which I compute. I have the neighborhood where I include myself as well. And then I compute the distance of all the participants in the neighborhood, all the citizens of the neighborhood, with respect to the centroid of the neighborhood, where the centroid is a non-existent citizen, of course. Right? Now, we can also have variations based on, say, I have a continuous variable versus a discrete variable. I can also have variations based on continuous scale versus discrete scale. Say, for example, if I take time as a scale, then it's a continuous variable. And now a continuous scale in itself. So if I take seconds versus minutes versus hours, it is a continuous scale. Now, if I take a Gaussian filter of certain, say, sigma value, then I can say that it's a discrete discrete scale. Okay, so then the last bit is how we use this. So today we'll talk about a specific example where it is used for feature computation or extraction. And specifically because we are talking about locality and local neighborhoods, we are going to be computing local features. Yeah. So in that regard, how do we extract the features? So that goes back to, we have these different scales. So what do we do with these different scales? We have many to one issue. So do we aggregate them? Do we concatenate them? Do we reduce them in whichever format? So that's essentially what we are going to do in the local feature computation versus extraction. Okay, so all of these have different computational methods. Now we go to another aspect of multiscale methods, and which is sort of exploited a lot in the computational methods, which is called the persistence across scales. Now, when I say something is persistent across scales, what I mean is, so I talked about already that there are coarse to fine scales or finest to coarsest scales. Now, in each of these scales, if I see the same thing, then I would say that that particular thing is persisting. Now, when we say a thing, what I really mean here is a feature or a particular characteristic of the data. So, for example, in images, if I have an edge and that edge is a very strong one, as in it is a key characteristic of that particular image, we would expect that edge to persist across different scales when we apply Gaussian filters as well. So then we can say that that is a very strong edge. So that's essentially what we mean by a feature persisting across several scales. So the idea here is also to denoise in some sense. So whichever features are not so strong, we tend to discard as we go along when we change the scale parameter and recompute the data, right? So the whole goal there is to, the single goal there is to capture these strong features by virtue of its persistence or presence across different scales. Now, yeah, so we use this particular phenomenon of persistence across scale for coming up with what a good multi-scale representation would be. What are the different new methods that we can use to even compute this aspect called persistence across scales, right? So given that there are these different nuances to multi-scale modeling, representation, analysis, etc., I have coined this term called multi-scale computational thinking, where the idea here is not to contest with the different theories or definitions of computational thinking itself. What we are looking at here is, given a problem, can we think of using multiple scales to solve the problem? And in that regard, how do we use those scales? So that is something that we have to come up with depending on each application. Okay, so let's look at some familiar images here. So this is essentially a map. This is a map of USA, and it's showing superficial mineralogy, right? Uh, this is true for any Google Maps as well, right? So what we are doing here is we are zooming in and out. So as we zoom in further, we see more details. So essentially what we call this going from courses to finest level is also looking at different levels of detail. So that's another terminology that is particularly used. So where I saw this one throughout my study of data visualization is, most of the visualizations today are governed by this particular visual information seeking mantra, which was again something that was coined by Ben Schneiderman, who is an HCI expert, human computer interaction expert from University of Maryland in 1996. So what he said was, do overview first, then zoom and filter, details on demand. Now what that means is, when we are visualizing a data set and the data set is very rich, we cannot make sense of the entire data set. So what we do is we first take a holistic view. That's the overview first. And then we figure out if we need to further zoom in and see any further. And when we say we are zooming in, we are not just magnifying the view. We are also adding more information that we can see when we zoom in. And so essentially we filter data and we retain some, right? And then we do this only on the demand of the user, as in the person who's using the visualization asks for these details, then we look at it. So this information seeking mantra has been so important in the area of visualization that most visualizations that are created now since 1996 onwards, this has been the governing principle. Right? So when we say we are using this, we are again essentially we can visualize this whole thing in the form of levels of detail. So level 0 is a courses level, and as we go along, we have this mental map of a pyramid representation. That's what we talked about when we said there is a hierarchical model that represents data here. Right? So we see the same thing when we use Google Maps, where we want to retrieve different tiles of the map as we zoom in, right? So the maps are of very high resolution, and there are limited resources to loading and viewing them. So what we then essentially do is we have this aspect of zoom level, and depending on the area that we zoom in, we actually load a different tile altogether. So these are, so here we, when we say there is a level of detail and a pyramid, each of these tiles are in itself a single tile, right? So it's not that we are just zooming into one portion of the tile here. We are actually loading a different tile altogether. Right? So you see the difference when we look at, say, for example, Google Maps. So if we were to look at the world, we see the physical map. And as we zoom in further, we see the country boundaries. And then as we zoom in further, we see state boundaries. And then we start seeing, cities and roads, etc. Right? So so the same concept is seen in GIS as well, this geographical information systems, where we see building information modeling also uses this particular terminology. It's a well used, well-known terminology that's used in BIM, which is LOD 0 to 4, where we say LOD 0 is footprint, LOD 1 is block model, LOD 2 is course exterior, etc. So we see this sort of recurring in several examples. Now moving on to the continuous scales, right? So we talked about these discrete scales now, where these are somewhat artificially introduced, but in accordance with the data itself. We also have continuous scales, which we see in most of the scientific data sets. So what we are looking at here is how processes in natural processes evolve. So here we can see that it evolves from locality, region, continent, globe, and it spans across different time scales. So present, tens of years, thousands of years, millions of years, etc. Right? So this is how we define or model processes in the natural processes, scientific processes, right? Now, if you look for this particular terminology called spatio-temporal scales, you would see a similar diagram coming up again and again, right? So that one was a little more generic. This one that we are seeing here is with respect to hydrodynamic morphology. And we start seeing similar patterns here, right? So the spatial scales start from sand grains to going up to sea level. And when we look at time scale, it goes from 1 second to century, right? And these are defining different natural phenomena using these different spatio-temporal scales. Now, this is another one which is to do with ecology and environment, and we see a similar pattern again, right? And these are sort of the standard way of representing different scales that occur in many of these different domains, and you see similarity in all of them, right? So a similar thing, if we see in terms of geographical information systems, we see that the different spatio-temporal scales also has implications on the way in which data is acquired. So you see that the spatial scales go from millimeters up to kilometers, and it spans across different time periods. And we see that the kind of data acquisition that is done is also different depending on the different spatio-temporal scale combination, right? So you can see that when the scales are much higher, you're looking at satellite remote sensing modes or methods for acquiring the data. So we look at another different example altogether. This is an example of the human brain, where the brain activity is measured using different scales. So there's different time scales in terms of how neurons behave and in what level, right? So we are going from the molecule to organism to how they interact and go to the environment. So one of the things that we have studied is something called the Connectome Networks, which we'll show in one of the examples. So if we look at spatial scales, especially, this is a human brain, and we see here that there are different regions of the brains. And then we look at the next scale is to look at next finer scale to look at is the neuronal populations. And if we go any further, we look at neurons, right? So, and here again, we see that depending on the different scales, different methodologies are used. So again, summing up, what do we mean by these multi-scale methods? They are essentially ensemble methods. So ensemble methods means you get solutions for different settings of the computational methodology, and these are local models, right? And here we look at various things like transition, which is to do with levels of detail that we talked about. There are also another set of modeling that we use, which is called the transfer functions, which is used a lot in physics. Then there are adaptive methods that we look at. So one of the things that we look at is, so we have, say, n number of scales, and of this, which one is the most important one? So there's an aspect of looking at an optimal scale determination. And there are consensus methods on how do you make sense of all these different scales. So which one do you pick, or which all do you pick together? So those come under the consensus methods. And there are some coexistence models where, say, for example, different physics models have to be put together. Like, say, we saw in Professor Shiva's talk about magneto-hydrodynamics. So if you want to put these different models together and couple them, then even multi-scale methods can be used. Now, this is not in isolation from the rest of how technology is growing. So we can see that the advances in parallel computing and storage technology has also allowed multi-scale modeling itself to be very widely used. So this plot is showing the number of articles which use multi-scale modeling in the title versus the year. So we can see from 1999 to 2007, it has been a steady rise. Okay. Now let's just quickly talk about uncertainty. So if we talked a little bit about, we have these multiple scales and we are trying to make sense of all of them together. So suppose we are aggregating them together, right? So as we aggregate them, we go from the finer scale to the coarser scale. So here we are looking at some material properties that are being aggregated across different spatial scales, and we see that uncertainty propagates. Right, this is the same thing that we saw in the image where we added Gaussian filters with higher scale parameter. The image got blurrier, and we can say that it propagates uncertainty in itself. Right? So while there's this aspect of uncertainty with data aggregation in multi-scale models, we can also use multi-scale models to alleviate uncertainty, which is by using this persistence of features across scales. We can say that if something has persisted across scales, it is the confidence level of that particular feature for that data set is very high, and we can use them for further analysis. And this is especially useful when in cases like, say, for example, the Connectome Network analysis that we just saw, where there is no ground truth, right? So there's no absolute ground truth by which we can make any sense of the data. Okay, so just to briefly talk about the different uncertainties, most of us in data science know of these terminologies. So uncertainties are of two types largely. There's alliterative uncertainty and epistemic uncertainty. Alliterative uncertainty comes from the way in which the data is represented or modeled, and epistemic is just by virtue of lack of knowledge. Within alliterative uncertainty, we look at homoscedastic or the heteroscedastic uncertainties. Homoscedastic uncertainty stays constant no matter how much you change the inputs. Heteroscedastic, on the other hand, changes with the input. So we look at essentially heteroscedastic uncertainty when we study multi-scale methods, where the idea is as we change the scale, there is differences in the uncertainty, and we can use that for understanding the data better. So I'll start talking about each of these examples that will give you an idea about how multiple scales are used. I will briefly talk about how uncertainties are handled in very loose terms. I won't talk too much about the uncertainty analysis anymore, because the goal of this talk is to say that these are, again, different ways in which you can look at data if you have to look at them from the point of view of different scales, or introduce different scales in a particular problem statement. Okay. So if we look at images again, here we are looking at wavelet transform, where a single image can be then can give 4 different images where the features across the 2 dimensions. Here it's a 2-dimensional data. So the features across the 2 dimensions are captured in certain level of coarseness and fineness. So if the data is captured coarsely in both the dimensions, we would get the Ci+1, which is a coarse level that goes to the next level of the transform. Then we also have one where it's high in one dimension, low in the other dimension, and high in the second dimension, low in the other direction, and this one is high in both the directions. Now we keep the high in both the direction to understand the details in the data. Now this is how the discrete wavelet transform function itself looks. So I won't go into details of discrete wavelet transform. We have better experts on campus for this, like Professor Uttam Kumar and Neelam Sinha and all. What I want to convey here is that how this can be used. So here we look at a single signal, that is the image signal that's coming in, and we apply a wavelet transform. We get this coarses level and the details, and then we can synthesize or reconstruct the data using the inverse of these transform functions, and then we can get back the data itself. So in a way, it is a lossless transformation. But for all practical purposes of this talk, we are actually talking about only the analysis aspect, where the idea is we'll see that how when certain features persist, we can use that for analyzing the data. So this particular thing that we are going to look at is the how it can be used for edge detection. So we all know in images, when we want to find the edges, there's a sharp change between the colors of a particular pixel and its neighborhood, and we mark that pixel as an edge. Now, so essentially we are looking at the gradients in the intensity of the color, and we mark it as edge. So that's essentially how most of the edge detection algorithms work. So we see canny edge detection. The only thing is that we see a lot more lines than the actual outline. The desired outline here is just this outline of the airplane, for example, but we do see lines from the clouds. In a similar fashion, we want to see discrete lines that outline the building, but the house, but we see other lines as well, mainly because there is a gradient that exists in those pixels, right? So we want to then denoise this to just keep the salient edges. So how do we do that? So in this particular example, what we are looking at is we can use wavelet transformation and keep the coarsest images, and then take what persists, what are the pixels that persist as edges across these different scales, and then keep them as edges, and then thus we get a much cleaned up image than what we saw using the canny edge detection. So this is one way of looking at it, as a persistent feature extraction, where we say that this particular feature persisted across different scales, so we are keeping them, and that marks the edges in those images. So to just see it more clearly, we can see that there are edges that persist. We can check if it persists across all the edges, and the other edges can be marked as noise, and then we get the clearer edges. Now, so that was sort of the precursor to how I got into multiscale methods. That was part of my master's thesis, actually. And now I work mostly with LiDAR point clouds and survey data sets, Connectome Networks, etc. So the rest of the three examples are of the work that we have done at IIIT in the graphics visualization computing lab. So I'll talk about how scales have been used in sort of different kinds of applications across the domains. Okay? So here we are looking at point cloud analysis. My interest in point cloud analysis is to look at how geometry can be used for extracting features. So here what we see is an airborne LiDAR scan of a geographical region. So this is a top view level, and a low flying aircraft is capturing laser scans using a LiDAR instrument. And these are points where the laser beam has been incident on an obstacle, and it returns and it marks the point, gives its altitude. So that's essentially what the airborne LiDAR is. So to simplify how we look at geometry, etc., let's look at a laser scanned object at close range. So this is a modified cube where we have this roof, which is a little, it has a slope, so we can look at what different features we get. So what we are essentially doing here is we want to study this point cloud. Point cloud is essentially a set of three-dimensional points. And what we want to say here is these are these edges, and these are the junctions here. And then we finally have the rest of the points, the surface points. Now, how do we get this? We again go back to the local neighborhood, say that we find a local neighborhood, and then we find the shape of the local neighborhood. Now, the shape we use for detecting the local neighborhood is different from the shape of the neighborhood itself. We use the shape of the local neighborhood to find the local neighbors, and then we find a closer fitting shape, right? So if the shape is like a line, we say it's an edge type feature. If it is a flat disc-like thing, we say it is a surface type feature. And if we can't figure out any particular shape around it, we say it's a junction type feature. Now, where do we get these values from? We take the local neighborhood first. So we have the size of, we use scale for finding the different sizes of the local neighborhood, which essentially is the spatial scale. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we have different types of neighborhood. It can be a cylindrical neighborhood, where I just define a cylinder around a point and say all the points contained inside that cylinder are my neighbors. Or I could count the number of neighbors and say I have k nearest neighbors. Or I define a sphere around it and I say it's a radial neighbor. Now, what do I do with that? I take all those neighbors, I find the covariance matrix between the positions of those neighbors and the point, and then we get the covariance matrix. Now, we have these different scales. So there is one question on how do we use these scales. So one of the ways in which these scales are used is using optimal scale, which is computed by, we say that there is a lot of uncertainty, there is minimal uncertainty in a particular point, which is given by the minimum Shannon entropy. And we say that that scale which gives us the minimum entropy is the scale that is the best, that gives us the best features. So in LiDAR point cloud analysis, this optimal scale determination is done by, we take these neighbors, compute this covariance matrix, and then we check which is the optimal by computing the Shannon entropy. And then we say that that particular scale gives us the best optimal features. And what we are looking for features is to say if each point belongs to a edge type class or a surface type class or a point type class. The reason why we need this is the signatures of these points belonging to these classes and its entirety will give us the classification. It will help us classify points as, say, a building point. So this is a semantic classification that we're talking about. So it will tell us the point is part of a building or a road or a tree, etc. Right? So what we essentially do is we take this covariance matrix, compute the eigenvalue decomposition, and then we find the local geometric features which are with respect to this these geometric classes that we talked about, the edge, the surface, and the junction types, and then we compute this. Now, in this particular example for computing this, we have used the aggregated feature extraction. So what that means is, for every point, I find if it is a line type feature or a surface type feature or a point type, the junction type feature. So I have a probabilistic distribution. Now I take that probabilistic classification and I add it all up, average it, and then I get an aggregated feature for each point. And then I can use that again in any kind of classifier, like a random forest classifier, etc. And it gives me the semantic class of that particular point. So we have found in our work that just like the optimal features, the aggregated features also work equally well, right? So I'll give you another example of where these scales are used. This is it's in terms of geometry, which is slightly different from geography that we talked about. So in geometry too, we do the same thing, but here we take a slight deviation. So what we do here is we take these different scales, but not from the size of the neighborhood, but with respect to the with respect to the filter that we apply there. So we take the neighborhood and then we apply a filter to it, where the filter, it's a Gaussian filter, which causes blurring of the surface that the particular set of points are defining, and then we say if it persists or not. Right? And this particular a way of using scales is used for again with respect to finding the entropy, etc., for finding feature lines in a geometric object. So usually when we look at computer graphics or geometric data sets, what we want to find are these characteristic feature lines which form silhouettes, right? So those are obtained using these surface variations, which are computed using these filters, where these filters, the scale that is used for the filters are generating multi-scale data here. So these are the essentially the feature edges that we get. This is a famous dragon data set that is used in just like this Stanford bunny data set. We have this dragon data set that's used a lot in computer graphics. And we can see that it gives edges quite nicely when using this method. So this was one of the earliest methods that were used with geometric data sets back in 2003. So this paper is quite seminal in that regard. So going back to our LiDAR point cloud, so if we look at, say, terrestrial LiDAR or airborne LiDAR, there have been other works where this multiple scale features have been, instead of aggregating them or finding an optimal feature, what one could do is just concatenate them, make a long vector, and use that in a classifier and then further use it. And that also has given good results. So here in particular, the kind of aggregation that is done is concatenation. Okay, so that's essentially what we did with point clouds. Now what we'll talk about is how we can use this different feature, different multi-scale methods in functional connectome analysis. Now, what we see on the right here is a set of networks that can be used to understanding brain. So here, what we see here is you can have data at its acquisition level. So here there are data from the molecular screening, etc. From that, a whole bunch of networks can be generated, where we see transcriptome, transcriptome, interactome, connectome, functional effective connectivity, social network, etc. Right, and this in itself have different scales, right? And what do we do with most of these network analysis is we try to find the local topology, we try to find communities, etc. Right? And the communities tell us, like, there is this groupism that you can find in many of these data sets, and that gives some kind of identity for certain objects. So going back to the functional connectivity, I'll briefly say what functional connectivity is. Functional connectivity is where we are looking at the different parts of the brain and saying that those different parts work together for a certain function. Now, these measurements are made when we use fMRI. We measure something called the Bolt signals, that is a blood oxygen level dependent imaging signals. And we use those signals to identify which regions of the brain work together for a particular function. And that function can be a motor function, it can be a cognitive function, it can be any kind of function, right? These are functions that I mentioned at a very high level. But even at resting state, when the subject is not doing anything, we can still find communities, because these parts of the brain work together for certain functionalities. Now, when we say that they work together, we are essentially trying to find these communities in a network of these different regions. What we get from this functional MRI data is these Bolt signals, and from the Bolt signals we can find correlation between the different regions of the brain, which is governed by a parcellation atlas, as in you divide the brain into different regions by certain defined regions. You don't randomly just divide, right? And between those regions, we can say that this is the correlation that I've gotten from the Bolt signals. Now, once we have that correlation matrix, we essentially have a correlation network between all the nodes in the brain. And then we are now trying to find the communities between the amongst those regions. So here, what we get by this function, by these communities, is something called the functional segregation. So what we say here is, for a particular function, these nodes work together. And what we also observe in human brain in particular is that while these are segregated by functions, there are connections between these different communities which also lead to functional integration, as in there is a communication channel between these different communities. So we see these different patterns in the way in which the human brain itself works. So what we see here is that there is these different regions in the brain are there, but they also get subdivided, and they can again form communities amongst themselves. So there's this notion of hierarchical organization of the brain, where even though spatially they are close to each other, functionally they could be doing different things altogether, because they are part of another community for another function. Right? So what we do here is, because it's hierarchically organized, it is very hard to say if the number of communities you would get from these nodes is like 5 or 6 or 7, because at every different hierarchical level, you can get different numbers of communities. So one of the ways we tried to identify a solution for a community detection in the Connectome network is using multiscale methods. So we'll briefly talk about the multiscale method that we use. And, but before that, let's just see how this works. So in the functional connectome, there is evidence that it works as a small world networks. Now, when we say a small world networks, it's somewhere, it can be modeled in between a regular and a random network, where we say that there are edges between nodes, randomly placed, but they're not highly random, that the randomness is 1, but it's not zero randomness, that is a regular network, but it's somewhere in between. So we have a small world network. So what we now want to find is that, okay, we have the small world network to the extent that there are very strong communities which are connected by strong edges between the communities, and there are lots of connections within the community itself, right? But very sparse, strong connections across communities. So that is what the definition of small world networks is. So what we want to now find is, how do we find these communities that define these small world networks? If we just look at the way it is done in the state of the art, a lot of the work happens where they filter the edges in the communities. For example, negative correlations in functional connectome is considered erroneous, so they remove them. Then they remove a lot of other edges which are weak, and then they get a filtered network, and then they find communities in there. But if you look at again, this method has its own issues. One of the issue is that if you change the, if you put up that threshold for the edge filtering a bit, you will start seeing different topologies in the network itself. So this is, these are 3 different representations of the same thing. This is using Notrix layout that is used in visualization. But what we see here is that the kind of communities you find and the kind of connections you have are very different when you just put up the threshold for that correlation value for filtering these networks. So a lot of the recent work is where people are looking at finding a method where you can avoid doing the edge filtering itself. And there is also recent work which says that negative correlations are not exactly erroneous, so they could be retained for further analysis. So one of the things we did was, instead of looking at network science solutions, can we go back to classical statistical methods for a solution? So we landed up at exploratory factor analysis. Now, exploratory factor analysis takes correlation matrices, which are correlation between random variables. We can assume the regions of the brain are random variables here, right? And then we compute the correlation matrix, right? And what we then do is, we group those random variables as a factor. Now, for example, these factors can be, they're not really labeled, we can add labels to them. So for example, here we have factors which are used in cognitive tests. So there are some variables which are sentences, vocabularies, sentence completion, etc., which go in language skills, and so on and so forth. So you can look at different kinds of factors that evolve from it. So what we looked at it as, okay, if we are getting some kind of grouping of random variables, then it is useful for us for finding community detection as well. But again, the problem with exploratory factor analysis is that it's an exploratory method. So you have to give the number of factors. Now, there is no ground truth in functional connectome that you have only 5 communities or you have only 6 communities in the human brain, because it is different from brain to brain, and depending on the data set you get, you can have any number of communities really. So what we did was we said we'll sort of take into account the entire data set and see what we have there. So we have what we did here was we computed we have this weighted functional connectivity matrix, which is a weighted network, right? So this is the aggregated correlation matrix from the subjects whose fMRI data has been taken. So we have a single matrix now. Now what we do is we find EFA for each number of factors. So we consider the number of factors as a scale here, and then we compute several the communities across several scales. Then for each scale, what we do is we check if 2 nodes belong to the same community or not. So the idea there is, if at some level when we increase the number of scales and then they split, that means them 2 nodes belonging to the same community is of a weaker likelihood, of a lower likelihood. So what we then do is we can aggregate these matrices that we get here, which is called the co-association matrix, where we say that it is a 1 if 2 nodes belong to the same community, or a 0 if they don't belong to the same community. So we get these as co-association matrices, aggregate them. So it's again a multi-scale method where we aggregate them. We get a representative co-association matrix, and then we do community detection on that matrix. Now what we get here is very strong communities, because if the co-association is very strong, they tend to cluster together. So we get really good communities detected from this particular co-association matrix. So this is a multi-scale method again, where we imposed this aspect that the number of factors per scale per EFA methodology is the scale, and then we apply the multi-scale method. So our method, now the results that we got, this is for a particular data set with 90 nodes, where we can visualize communities very well. We found that it broadly matches with the kind of modules that are theoretically found in the brain. So there are these 5 modules broadly that are found. This is a motor and auditory module, default mode network module, limbic and subcortical areas, visual processing, attention processing, and our results also match quite a bit with the it matches absolutely, mostly absolutely, except for 1 or 2 nodes. It matches really well with the modules that are already known. So these are some more visualization as to how the clusters are changing. So this is using our EFA method, and this is using the hierarchical consensus clustering, which is a state of the art. And we see that all the nodes which belong to the community here also are mostly here. So the more crisscross lines you see, it means that the communities are not matching. So we see that there are very few crisscross lines here. And if we have to look at, as we increase the number of scales in this particular data set, especially that we had, we saw that when we increase the number of scales, we saw this hierarchical pattern where a community started subdividing further and further. Again, we didn't see this for a couple of other data sets that we looked at. At this particular data set, as we increase the number of scales, we actually saw this nice hierarchical decomposition pattern, which again sort of goes well with the theoretical model that we have for functional control. So the last example I have is with respect to human geography. So what we are looking at here is population count data and mapping them to geographical regions and finding hotspot maps. Hotspot maps just means that there is a highly dense population that meets a particular criteria, right? So what we see here is so starting with A here, we see these are point patterns of crime in a particular region. And we can visualize this by collecting all of them in different ways. And this particular thing that we see here, which is using the kernel density estimation, is very useful for us in making scale aware visualizations of the hotspot maps. So what do I mean by that? So we look at what kernel density estimation itself is and what we are talking about here. So let's see what happens when we look at this particular image here, right? So this is the overview image, and we are seeing that there is a lot of crime in this particular region. Now, when we look at this image, the impression that we get is that, this region, the entire region has a lot of crime. But that's not true usually, because if you further zoom in, you can see that there are clusters of crime that happens even within this highly dense region as well. It's not, so the density is not a uniform density, but by virtue of several highly dense clusters in that particular region, when you zoom out, you see that there is a highly dense cluster or a hotspot that you see there, right? So this particular effect we can get by using the kernel density estimation by tweaking these parameters that we see here, which are the bandwidth and the cell size. So what we are doing here is we have these point patterns, spatial point patterns. So if we say we have these kernel functions, which are usually Gaussian functions, to say that this is the influence of a particular point to its neighbors, and we sum up those influences, we essentially get the density estimate, which is called the kernel density estimate. Now, there are certain other variants of it, but the reason why smooth kernel density estimate is usually done is because it is a smooth function, and you can kind of see a diffusion pattern in the data, and how it is high at a particular point, and it sort of diffuses out into its neighborhood. Unlike the other functions that we can use, which is the histogram and the box kernel, where there are sharper changes. So again, the kernel density function itself is governed by its bandwidth. So we have to choose the right bandwidth for getting appropriate data. So if the bandwidth is very low, then you again start seeing it becomes as good as the box kernel. And if the bandwidth is too high, then it diffuses a lot, and you don't see much variation. So finding an appropriate bandwidth matters a lot. So let's look at where we applied this. So this is the NFHS 4 data set. There's a National Family Health Survey data where we looked at these kernel density estimation. Now we have the point pattern data for child malnutrition for children under 5, who are all the households which have malnourished children for different kinds of undernourishment. So we look at stunting, underweight, and wasting. And this is how it is varying in India. Now, if you have noticed, news articles in the last couple of years, there has been a huge hue and cry on malnutrition in Karnataka as well, right? So if you look at the India data set, you don't really see South India as much impacted as the Ganges belt here, right? But then the question is, why do we see the numbers otherwise, right? So if you look at if you zoom in further, right? So if you look at it at a global level, you get how the variations are in the entire country. But when you zoom in at the state level and recompute the kernel density estimates for that particular state, you start seeing that there are variations within the state. And we particularly see that North Karnataka is very badly showing, has very bad indicators in NFHS 4. And the current data of NFHS 5 has shown that it has actually improved. But in the NFHS 4 dataset, we do see hotspots of malnourishment in children in the northern Karnataka and parts of central Karnataka with respect to underweight and stunting. So this analysis has been done using two-dimensional histograms and kernel density estimates. So with that, I'll conclude my talk. So what I have wanted to imply today was that there are different ways in which multi-scale methods can be used as powerful tools for discovering knowledge from data. And we can, of course, look at them through visualizations, etc. Now, this also goes back to this nice phrase that was given by Fotheringham, uh, who said one size does not fit all, to imply that local modeling is very important for understanding data. This he had mentioned with respect to spatial data. He's an expert on geographical weighted regression models. So what he had mentioned was a global model does not fit very well, and there's no, he literally said that there's no shotgun model to explain data in itself. So what he had mentioned is this renewed call for understanding and modeling data using local phenomena. So this is a paper in 2020, so it's very recent, where he again said that a lot of the phenomena that we see in natural data sets, human behavior, etc., can be studied better using local models. So where especially multi-scale models will play a role. So we have, these are the different projects that we are doing in our lab. So of which we did use multi-scale methods for large-scale airborne LiDAR point cloud analysis as well, where we use a decision-making system where it decides which multi-scale method is better, which multi-scale aggregation method is better used. We have again used similar work for SAR image flood extent estimation, where we have used different methodologies. That comes mostly under ensemble methods. So we have used it in different topics again. So these are all the students and collaborators who have worked in these varied projects. And as mentioned in the introduction, our lab has been generously funded by various funding agencies. So we thank all of them. And I'll stop the talk with the conclusion slides. I'll be happy to take the questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Jaya, for a very informative talk. Are there any questions that people would like to ask? Please unmute and ask, or ask in the chat. Okay, I have a question until someone else speaks up, a very brief question. Professor Jaya, most of your work is on spatial data, right?
Yes.
So when you have temporal data where you have different mechanisms operating at different, say, relaxation times, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so to be, yeah, so the Connectome network is actually spatio-temporal data, because the bold signals capture both time as well as space. But the correlation matrix somewhat obliterates the temporal aspect. So we haven't looked at the temporal aspect in that regard. So far I haven't worked so much in the temporal data, but I would assume that you can, so we have just about started working with vehicle LiDAR data, where we are looking at both spatial and temporal aspects of the data, because there are closer timestamps as opposed to the airborne LiDAR, where even though the data is captured over a period of time, the scale of space is much higher than the scale of time. So you can assume that it's mostly spatial data set. But on the other hand, the vehicle LiDAR data is spatiotemporal data. So we have started looking at feature extraction over time. But if you look at it from the discretized point of view, you would bunch certain time frames and then capture data, capture features again. And you can change that, how many time steps you would take to adjust to control the scale parameter itself. So that's how that would work. I mean, at least in my set of projects, I would use it in that aspect. So the idea there is, if you have a function which is in XYZ, so it's a trivariate function, you can make it 4 variables, XYZ, T, and then do similar analysis.
Okay, thanks.
But again, I understand there have, so in tensor voting, they have done a lot of work where they bucket space, the spatial variables together, and they bucket the temporal variables separately, because space and time are have different connotations altogether. So they're not necessarily seen as 4 independent variables. They are seen as 3 independent variables with a certain semantics, and time is a different semantic, and the scales are computed accordingly.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Okay.
There are a couple of typed questions I had typed.
Yeah, I see that. I'm not sure which part of the talk this is. Does this work for light sheet and 2 by multi-photon data? Have these methods been applied to zebrafish, fruit fly, nematode brains? The functional connectome analysis has been done on other brains than the human functional connectome. It has been done for C. elegans, for instance. I don't know as much about zebrafish and all. So the idea there is you can use similar methods, but most of these methods tend to be exploratory than confirmatory, depending on how you use the data set. So I haven't personally seen for zebrafish or fruit fly.
Have you used multiphoton and light sheet data?
If you can tell me what application or the context, then I can understand it.
No, the multiphoton data images the fluorescence of the neurons in the brain directly by using 2 photon absorption. In fact, that was what was shown by Florian Engert in his Harvard lecture. That was the whole thing.
Okay.
And similarly, light sheet goes and takes sheets of the brain, slices of the brain due to the very narrow depth of focus.
Right.
Have you tried these methods?
So the answer is no, because I have looked, so the way we have looked at that data set is, so the fMRI data itself, which is volumetric data, we don't really work directly with them. We have worked with the labs that process that data. They generate the correlation matrix based on a parcellation atlas. So the
thing is, the light sheet and multiphoton are almost per neuron, and it's one of the, it is almost directly in where applicable, it is more higher, superior to fMRI. Where applicable, it's a direct measurement.
Yes, I understand. Yeah. So the way neuronal networks are analyzed is different from the functional connectome, which is with respect to regions. Those are inter-region networks. They are not inter-neuronal population or interneuron networks. There are some other networks as well. For example, apart from functional connectivity, there is structural connectivity, and there's also something called the effective connectivity networks. So there are multiple connectomes which can be studied, and I believe for neuronal populations and neuronal networks, they look at other kinds of networks, not necessarily functional connectomes. Functional connectomes has a lot of information loss because of the exact thing that Ashok just asked about, how the temporal data is analyzed. When we compute the correlation, the temporal aspect is lost. So so if many of these, that when you talk about the neuronal network, the time scale also matters. So the kind of analysis that's done is very different from what is done.
You might want to see how it's applicable, because that was exactly Florian's talk.
Okay.
Are there any other questions? Okay, if not, perhaps we can thank Professor Jaya again for a very nice talk. And I believe she has another commitment shortly. So I think we can wrap up this.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.